All right, here we are. We have just transcended the space-time continuum and come together in this asynchronous space. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new, and thanks to everyone for listening today. How are you? Is everybody doing okay? Things still feel pretty heavy. I don't know if that's true for everyone else, but certainly was true for me. Kind of a lot of shittiness all around. Everywhere I looked, something shitty. I'm trying to not let my cynicism get the best of me. Fortunately, I have a wonderful talk today to share with you with Haley Laughter, and I will tell you about that in just a bit. First, as I was saying though, it's been a really challenging week to not feel profoundly cynical. I'll give you one small example, because it's just happened today. If you've got small children in a public school, then you've probably had this experience where the PTA is always needing to raise a bit of money to, do the things that the PTA does. And the usual ways in which the PTA raises that money is to do these sort of fundraising kind of things where the kids sell chocolate, or, for instance, my daughter's got this event that they're doing, which is like a night out with a parent and a kid, like maybe even a father and a daughter, to go to like a trampoline park at night, and they do it with lights, and it's this, this event. But the event is to raise money for leukemia research, I believe. And anybody who knows me knows I have, a personal relationship. My mother passed away of leukemia. So that's a cause that I really would support. But the reality of it is, the way this event happens is we spend, it's going to be like $30 for my daughter to go to this event, but only $5 of that is going to the leukemia research. The rest of it is just profit for this place. And it's not that I don't want that place to do good. It just, why don't we just give the $30 to the leukemia research? And it's like that with all of the other stuff that they do too, where it just seems like instead of spending all this money to profit these partners, we just give that money to the school and we'd be better off. But we don't do that because I don't know why. It's just the way we do stuff, sort of backwards. So I don't I don't know if I'm the only one who gets annoyed by this kind of thing. It just seems like we don't always act in ways that serve our interests. We do these weird things because we think that's the way it's always done, and we just carry on doing it that way. And maybe it's time to stop just carrying on doing it the way we've always been doing it. And there's something uncomfortable about that maybe, right? We all know that when you're changing patterns, sometimes it's not comfortable. Anyways, sorry to bum anybody else out. There has been other unfortunate news that I feel compelled to mention. Tao Porchon Lynch passed away this week. And Tao, she was a really special person. I only got to meet her the once. I got to have a practice with her, and I recorded a talk with her. And that talk is over a year old, so it had become part of the premium subscription. But we've made it free again, so if you want to go back and listen to it, you can go back through the feed. It's down there, and you can listen to that talk I had with Tao. It was really inspiration to meet her, and I'm sure others of you out there who met her had the same experience. My condolences to those who were very close to her and her family, and I'm sending some love to you, Tao, and I can already feel it coming back. Also, And I don't know any way to cushion this, but Goldie the goldfish passed away this week. And if you're a long-time listener, then you remember that Goldie was our first family pet. My eldest daughter won her at a fair a little over a year and a half ago. You know, you throw the ping pong ball in the thing and you get the goldfish. And I'm told that they normally don't live more than, say, 6 months. So apparently she had a long life for a goldfish that you get at the fair. But I did come to have a bit of a relationship to her. If you also remember, it was maybe 7 months ago that I got her a larger tank and I screwed up and I almost killed her, remember? And then I nursed her back to health. And she'd been thriving again. And last week I brought her up for the first time in a long time. I mentioned the algae bloom, right? Well, a few days after I mentioned that, she took a real sharp turn. I believe that the water levels took a turn for the toxic for her. And when I got to the pet store to get some stuff to try to address it, I talked to the guy, and she really had outgrown the tank again. She was huge. You're supposed to have 2.5 gallons for every inch. And she was almost 5-6 inches. She was huge. And the girls were also, I think, feeding her way too much. And I did do my best, and I made some efforts, and it looked like she might pull through, but then she didn't make it. So we're having a ceremony for her tomorrow, actually. We're going to bury her in the backyard and give her a proper resting. The girls were really good about it. They weren't too upset. I think, honestly, the cats, the cats are the new focus and love, and maybe Goldie really served her role for our family. I wish I could have known more about taking care of fish. I certainly learned a lot. Can't say I'm running out to get a new fish. It is a lot of work. I know better. I wish I could have gotten her a bigger tank and given her even a longer life. But it is what it is. So we loved you, Goldie. You brought a little something to this family, and you will be missed. Now, the thing that has been helping me the most to deal with not just my cynicism, but these waves of grief as well, is touching base with the natural environment. I was talking about this last week, about how I went to the desert and the effects of that on my nervous system. So I was really trying to make a point this week at home of taking time to go outside or in some way just touch base with not screens, not politics, but just something actual and tangible, like wind on my face or sun on the backs of my eyelids. And that is very much the topic of today's conversation with Haley Laughter. As you will hear, the origins of this conversation come out of another talk I had a little while back with someone from the Desi community. We were talking about cultural appropriation in yoga and the difference between appropriation and appreciation. And in the outro, I made a few comments about how I didn't know much, if anything, about the indigenous cultures of the lands in which I was born. And I was curious if there was any yoga connections to that culture. Well, a number of listeners reached out and pointed me in some different directions. And one of those directions was Haley. And I'm so glad that I got a chance to talk with her, because she really did educate me on a few things and inspire me with a few things. So I'm excited that you're going to get to hear that today. Before we do, let me take a moment to once again touch base with any of you who own or manage a studio and are not so happy with the studio management software you're using. You know who you are, and I know there's a bunch of you out there. Maybe the pricing just got jacked up, or maybe it's always been a pain in the ass to use it. Well, I want to recommend that you check out today's sponsor, Karmasoft. And if you've been around, you've heard me talk about Karmasoft before because they are our longest standing sponsor. And it is the software that I used when I had my center back in Brooklyn. The owner, Rudy Senecal, he's been on the show before. You can go back and listen to the episode. It's quite informative about the company and how he runs it. And I just think it's a far superior product. It's easier, it's more efficient. I think it's better suited to independent studios that aren't in need of all the bells and whistles and just the simple thing that you need to schedule your classes and do the payroll and not have all the other stuff in the way of that. Well, Karmasoft is the way to go. So do yourself a favor. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Also, I have some upcoming dates for the Gentle is the New Advanced Easing the Pain Tour 2020. And if you've been listening and you think it would be fun to hang out and have practice together, I would love to see you. I'm going to be in Sarasota, Florida, March 21st and 22nd. I'm going to be in Austin, Texas, April 11th and 12th. You can register for those dates, find out about more, or just learn about the tour in general at jbrownyoga.com/tour. That's jbrownyoga.com/tour. Okay, I think that is it. I think we're good to go. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Haley Laughter. Hello?
Hey, good morning.
Ah, there you are. Now I've got you.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now. And I'm happy to get a chance to speak with you. I totally understand that you needed to reschedule. The fact that you were being of service to people in locations that don't have internet seemed like a perfectly appropriate reason for you to have to reschedule with me.
Yeah, I apologize for that. But happy Valentine's, by the way.
Oh, yeah, it's Valentine's Day. That's right. Happy Valentine's to you. I sometimes get a little cynical about it being too much of like a Hallmark thing. But I do like the sentiment of, compassion to others by all means.
Yes, for sure. I agree with you.
Well, Haley, it's great to get a chance to speak with you. I'm curious. I was getting ready to talk to you. Are you in New Mexico right now?
Yes, I am actually in Gallup, New Mexico. And that's where I live part-time, but I live mostly in Albuquerque, but I go back to Gallup, New Mexico, and it's closer to the reservation, so I really enjoy it there.
Well, that's kind of crazy because I was in, I don't know how far away it is, but I was in Las Cruces, New Mexico last weekend.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, for the first time ever. And I was just remarking here on the show last weekend, just to myself in general, like what a fantastic experience it was being in the desert.
Did you go to the White Sands Monument?
I didn't have a chance to go because I was only there for a tight trip, but the person I was staying with specifically mentioned that next time we would have to make a point of going there. I understand that is quite a sight. Yes.
And of course the border of Mexico is right there too, if you're feeling daring.
But I was really, the thing I was struck by most was like on a very basic level that there was almost no 2-story buildings. Like everything was 1-story buildings. And I'm from like New York City and stuff. So I'm just so used to everything being built vertical that when there's...
Oh my gosh, yeah, the contrast. The contrast of the two is so amazing.
Yeah. And it seems like when you have so much open space, why would you build up? You just build out.
Yeah, right? There's definitely, I've been to New York City one time and it was crazy busy. I mean, people everywhere, and it was really fast paced. And New Mexico is so, like they call it the land of enchantment, and it is definitely the land of enchantment. There's just like, it's so calm here. Even like in the city in Albuquerque, it's small, but it's big, as far as like, it's growing for sure. More people are coming out this way to settle and to retire, but, it's got this, I don't know, like this magic or like this feeling to it to where it's, there's a connection. And not only that, but there's a lot of different tribes around in this area that help feed that cultural, balance to it.
Well, first, I definitely had an experience of the pace because it did feel like so much more relaxed, like what the land of mañana they were saying, right? And it definitely felt like my experience was, it felt like a really long exhale. It was like, like a load off just to be in that environment, which was really, I could feel it in my nervous system. So it's interesting. I was remarking how, the environment shapes us so much.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah. And then you were just saying that there are a lot of tribes there. Is that what brought you to New Mexico?
Actually, yeah. So I am originally from Salt Lake City, Utah. I grew up there. When I was about maybe 29, 30, I did my first yoga teacher training. And I moved down to Gallup, New Mexico actually, I settled there to help my brother start his practice, which he's a psychiatrist. And so I went there, me and my sister-in-law started the first hot yoga studio there. And then I eventually broke off from that and started my own business. But I am actually, my mom's from, Chilchilta, which is like 30 miles south of Gallup. And my dad is from Shanto, Arizona. So I'm Navajo, Native American.
Well, maybe before we get to New Mexico, you said you grew up in Salt Lake City. And, I went to when I was a kid. And, it's interesting. I should have said this to start. I mean, I mentioned this to you maybe in your email, but I want to mention it again here, like sort of the motivation behind this conversation. I've, been having conversations on this show about cultural appropriation. And not too long ago, I had someone from the Desi community on, and we had a long conversation about, her experience of experiencing historical trauma and the feelings that they have when certain Westerners are insensitive, when they're appropriating rather than appreciating. And after that conversation, I really got to thinking about just indigenous cultures in general and realizing that I knew so very little about the indigenous culture of the lands that I was born on. And I, when I was in college, I was I was into conspiracy theories and reading histories that weren't I got when I was a kid, that I read about the atrocities of what was done to Native American people, and I've always known that the country that I was born in, that the United States of America, had a history of terrible, terrible deeds. But it's so different to know that, to even know that the history books aren't written correctly for the kids, like when I was growing up in public schools, and to then actually have an experience of that. That's what I've been learning through these conversations, that even if I have some idea about it, I can't see it through someone else's eyes. And my white male privilege has really been something I'm reckoning with, So one of the listeners of this show heard me talking about that and said, you should talk to Haley. That's why I reached out to you, because I wanted to hear from somebody who could speak to that more directly. So just to say all of that, as a little bit of an introduction for you and for anybody who listens to this, as to where this is coming from. Yeah,
I think it's definitely a subject that's not really talked about. It is more and more today, but it is definitely, the history is wronged in all of that we learn, in school.
Yeah. I mean, I remember being shocked by that when I was in college, because I, remember the history books when I was growing up, and, getting all the right answers at the end of the chapters or whatever. But to then learn what actually happened or to read other accounts, and to be like, wow, the history. And it's, we're kind of experiencing all kinds of rewriting of history and propaganda right now too, but that's another story. I guess I'm curious to go back to your childhood in Salt Lake City and your folks. What brought them to Salt Lake City? Jobs, or what was the story behind you growing up in Salt Lake City if your parents weren't born there?
That's a good question. So my parents were part of the placement program, and also part of the whole assimilation that happened with us as Native Americans, as Indigenous people.
I'm sorry, can you explain what that is? Because I don't know that any people would know what that is. I don't know what it is.
Sure. So there was an act that was put upon all Indigenous people in the area. It was the Assimilation Act, where they wanted to basically destroy who we were as a culture, as a people, and assimilate who we were to what they thought was dignified, or what they thought was, what was appropriate to their standards. And when I say to their standards, I'm talking the European or the white culture per se. And so all children on the reservations were ordered to go to school, to go to boarding schools. And so my dad went to a boarding school. When he was 10 years old, he was sent to a boarding school in California, Bishop, I believe. And he was forced to cut his hair. He was forced not to speak his language. If he did speak his language, he was, they were hit, they were beaten. They had conditions of conformity, conforming to whatever the school or the school's rules were. So you take a child who comes from, living off the land, has mom, dad there, living off the land. They have a certain way of life, ripping them from that and basically trying to erase all of the cultural knowledge that they have, the identity of who they are, and placing them into this unfamiliar way of living, and forcing them to erase and to be ashamed of everything that they've learned or everything that they knew of who they are. And so my dad went to boarding school. My mom was placed with a Mormon family in Salt Lake City, Utah. Eventually, my dad and my mom met at a school dance in Brigham City, and then they settled in Sandy, Utah, where I grew up. Now, where this all affects me is through that trauma that they experienced, not only from the boarding schools, but also the trauma of alcoholism. It then translated through my childhood. So my parents were alcoholics, and my dad never spoke about what happened until recently in the boarding schools. My mom died from alcohol when I was 8 years old, and so, but my dad continued being an alcoholic, but he was there for us. He loved us. He never hurt us, but he dealt with that pain through the alcohol. And so I pretty much grew up really fast, and that was part of the trauma, they say it takes like 4 to 7 generations to heal that. And so my decision was to change that and not to become an alcoholic, not to turn into, relieve my pain through alcoholism, but rather I found yoga, and that's where I felt my energy, where I tried to rid of that trauma and that pain and that hurt that I had. And the pain and the hurt that I had is from the abandonment of my mom dying from alcohol, the domestic violence that I witnessed, the insecurity of home, of not feeling safe because of that domestic violence. And as a child, this imprints on you deeply, and you don't realize it until you're older, is when you really realize how that affects you, how historical trauma shapes you. And so that's when I started really looking into who I was and who I am as an Indigenous person, because I grew up in the city. I had no identity. I was amongst these white people still.
Yeah, I was going to say that I've been to Salt Lake City a few times. Like, we used to go there for ski trips. And I just remember it being like a really, really white place. And like even the beer only had half alcohol in it. Whenever it was like a really, I remember it being, even to me, being a white person from Los Angeles, feeling like it was kind of repressive.
Right. I mean, that place is really, I mean, you feel like everything you do is wrong, dominated by the Mormon religion.
Yeah. Well, let me also just acknowledge some of the things you just said, because it was a lot that you just opened up with us so much. I mean, I have a 10-year-old daughter right now. So when you described your father being taken away from his parents at 10, I can't imagine that. And it's just like, we've been taking kids away from their parents, brown kids away from their parents forever, seems like.
Yep.
And then, my mom died when I was 16. It wasn't from alcoholism, it was from leukemia, but I know what it is to feel that kind of, loss and grief.
Yeah.
I can't imagine to have that happen so young. So it's pretty incredible that you were able to find a way to not give in to those pressures to hurt yourself. Those are huge challenges to overcome. So just like, as someone who's never met you before and just heard your story for the first time, that's pretty amazing. And that yoga was the way that you were able to do it is similar to me. And I think a lot of people who listen to the show, yoga often becomes like a vehicle to sort these things out for ourselves. Yeah.
And this is so true. When I first started yoga, it was actually the Bikram yoga that I started with, and I fell in love with it because I felt like it was cleansing me. It was similar to like the sweat lodge, where you just sweat and release a lot of those toxins and negativity. It was difficult. You go into a sweat lodge, it's not easy sometimes, because you're sitting there, and especially depends on who's running it. Some of them are really hot, where it's like it's burning your skin hot, but you mentally have to take your place somewhere else. Just like in yoga, it's a meditation. You go into a meditative place to where you can find calmness and stillness. And then you're releasing all of that, the sweating and the toxins and allowing your body to release. It feels so good. And that's how I kind of, I began creating my format of creating the Indigenous philosophy with the Indian yogic philosophy, and how they're similar.
That's so interesting, like the connection between hot yoga and a sweat lodge. I'd never thought of that before. And
yeah, it's cleansing.
I guess, I'm curious what was your experience of your Native American culture growing up? Did your parents retain some of that while you were growing up? Like, did you go to sweat lodges when you were a kid? Or like, what was your experience of Native American culture growing up with your parents after they had been quote unquote assimilated?
That's a good question. So because of the assimilation, they didn't teach us the language. They didn't take us to ceremony. I mean, they didn't expose us to those kinds of things, other than an occasional visit to my grandparents' house, who still live the same way in a mud hogan, on the land in a remote area. We'd be there for like a couple of days, or and then come back to the city. And that was
what was that
our
like?
life.
What are your memories of that, of going there? Like, how old were you when you were going there, and what was that like?
I was going there since I was small, and like I said, my dad's from Shanto, Arizona, which is just on the border of Utah and Arizona, and it's in a remote area called Tall Mountain, and it's beautiful. I just remember, well, I go there now, but it's like red sand. It's so quiet that you can feel the air is clean, and you can hear birds. And last summer I went to Shanto, and I did one of the things that my dad had just briefly told me about. He said, and I tried it. He said, I love to lay underneath a pinyon tree and just take a nap. So I went for a hike. I laid underneath a pinyon tree. It was hot, but the cool, soft, red sand just soaked me up. And it just felt so good because I wanted to experience what he experienced as a child, what he enjoyed as a child. And, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And, so I love Shanto, and I love to experience that.
I mean, that's what I was sort of saying, like even just a brief time in the desert, I could feel a difference. But that description of laying I don't think I've ever taken a nap under a tree in my life ever. I mean,
and the sky's so blue, and it's beautiful. It's so beautiful to be away from everything, technology, to be away from the hustle, the bustles, the stresses, that we go through. And that's part of the stress that we carry in our body also.
So when do you start to, for yourself, begin to recognize that you've been divorced from this part of your genetic, like your culture, like how old are you? Like, are you in college when you start to this? Do you start to ask your parents, or when does it start to occur to you that you've been divorced from this in some way?
Well, so I was, I was 28, 29. I started practicing yoga. It was actually through my yoga practice where I wanted to delve deeper into who I am.
Well, what were you doing?
And find my identity.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what were you doing until you were 28? What did you have, like some other kind of job you did, or some other kind of life you were leading?
Yeah. So I was in corporate. I worked at Discover Financial Services. And I was in management, and then I also have 4 children. Okay. I had the house, the 2 cars, everything was like perfect per se, on the outside. But inside, again, I was in the city. I started my yoga practice, and I wanted to delve deeper into who I am and my identity, so I started questioning things. Yeah. Eventually, that led me to my roots back to New Mexico, and where my mom's from, and I started attending ceremony. I started involving myself into my culture and learning about these ways, and also spiritually praying about it, and being more in tune with my spirit, and understanding how these concepts and that my culture has a whole system of healing, a whole system of connection to all the elements, a whole system of prayer, and absorbing that is when I really started delving into who I am and questioning who am I, and where did I come from, and how did all this trauma happen, and is it real? Is historical trauma real? That's when I began questioning and really persisting on connecting to who I am, and my, going back to my grandparents' house and staying there, and involving myself, and that's when I started creating that identity.
Well, that question that you asked of, like, is historical trauma real? I think that's like such an important question, because in all these conversations I've been having around, cultural appropriation, some people don't think it is real, or want to make it out as though it's not. But to people who experience it is most certainly real, that even things that happened before you were born are still affecting your experience of how life is happening now.
This is true, yep. And the reason why I had to question that is because I grew up in the city. I grew up, in the hustle, the bustle. I grew up going to school there. And things, there was something else inside of me that wanted to know about my culture, about who I am, where I come from. And so when I started understanding, I actually worked in the behavioral health area for a while. I started to understand, as far as like watching my people suffering, the suffering. Okay, so I'm trying to explain this more articulately. Let's say, okay, so I grew up in the city, had the home, and all these things that we're supposed to achieve. Okay, this whole idea that we have of what is perfect. I moved to New Mexico, Gallup, New Mexico, which is the heart of our Navajo people in that central area. And there's a lot of alcoholism. There's a lot of pain there. And to take myself from that, the city of what life's supposed to be, and we're all achieving this, to living in the pain, to seeing it every day, to understanding, feeling it on my spirit, feeling it inside of me, experiencing it. And then also being triggered of this feeling that I had in Gallup is the same feeling I had as a child. And it's this feeling of uneasiness and gosh, there's so much pain, and then I started to question, okay, historical trauma, what is it? How did this affect me? How is it affecting me? And how do I change this?
I mean, I certainly can't speak to indigenous cultures, but I feel like on some level there's like this, what you're describing, this how Native American culture, from what I understand of it, was so intimately in relationship to the natural world. And the description of like removing that culture from that natural world in a way, or like impeding its ability to be in relationship with it. We've done that to all the cultures, we've removed ourselves from the natural world in that way. And that life that I'm leading and that you were leading compared to, the remnants of what happens on reservations, it's a stark contrast, but that's the thing that I feel we have to mend. We have to get into better relationship, not just with the natural world, but with the indigenous cultures that we also did these things to.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that so when I began practicing, and then I started connecting, I absorbed myself into yoga, my culture. What I did is I wanted to help my people through yoga. And so I started identifying the different similarities between Native American culture, my culture, Navajo, Diné culture, and then also, yogic philosophy. And the whole concept of my small business, Hajo Total Wellness, is being able to preserve culture while promoting wellness. And these concepts that we have are similar to that of the Indian philosophy. We're just my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and then before them, they're the yogis on this side of the world. That's how I perceive it.
Well, I think that there's universalities through yoga, and that makes perfect sense because I feel like I've been able to connect to all kinds of people from different cultures through sort of ideas and practices that I found through yoga. So it makes sense to me. I guess I'm also curious, before we get to that application, which I am interested to hear more about, I'm curious about your personal process of how yoga practice helped you. Like, what did it do for you to help you see these things? Like, because that's kind of a big choice. Sound like you had a pretty cushy life there. And you chose for whatever reason, you felt like that wasn't the direction you to go. And I don't know if you had to convince your husband or what, but it interesting to me to understand how yoga practice does that for people. So I'm wondering, how did doing hot yoga, or how did doing yoga practice, I don't know if you stayed with hot yoga, if you moved on to other things, but how did your yoga practice transform you in that way that you made that choice?
I feel like it began as a challenge, my ego, because I wanted to be able to hold that asana, or being able to do the standing bow. I wanted to look pretty in an asana, and it began ego-based. But the more I practiced, the more I had to look at myself in the mirror, the more I had to accept myself the way that I am and acknowledge the flaws of who I am, and really create an awareness from within first by breaking down that ego, and then being able to explore myself and who I am, begin this questioning of finding myself. And so, but I was also, at the same time as I was questioning, I knew that we're energy. And in order for us, energy, no matter if it's you're angry, you're sad, you're happy, it doesn't matter. It's still energy. And that energy has to be expelled some way. And in order to expel it, we can choose how we want to expel it or recycle it. So if we're angry, we can recycle that energy and put it into something else. And being able to, I knew that in order for me to shift this, not turning to alcohol, because there was a point when I wanted to turn to alcohol, when I did, and I was taking a couple shots, at night to go to sleep because I was so stressed out that I was like, whoa, like what's going on here? I literally had the shot in my hand. I'm like, you have to make a decision on what you want to do and how you want to use this energy. And that's when I started really focusing on yoga and my practice, and taking that ego out and just more working on my mind. So it went from ego-based to my mind, training my mind to focus and training my mind to expand at the same time, opening up myself to other things.
Well, you said something else there. You said, and I wrote it down, you said awareness from within. And I think that's even more than mind to me. Yes, I think I totally know what you mean when it comes to being like it's about mind, or being able to direct your attention and stuff. But it also, this idea of awareness from within, I'm very intrigued, because I recently just had a talk with Nishala Devi, which I think we'll post after this. And she was really talking about it not being controlling the mind, but like residing in the heart. And when you describe that moment, there's also like a heart moment where you're like, for your care for yourself, and an awareness from within is what allows you to see that moment for what it is and make a different choice. I don't know. That's what I think yoga practice does a lot of times. It helps people develop the ability to have that kind of awareness from within. It gives you a bit of a tools to go off of, so that you have the facility you need to make that choice in the moment, like when you were standing there with the shot glass. If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.